There is one thing that you must always be committed to, I think, and that is the truth. You must never go along with a lie.
Is America exceptional or fundamentally flawed? These abstract moral questions dominating our political discourse often lead to highly inflammatory debates in what we call the culture wars. Some might say that the culture wars distract us from important policy discussions. Others might say that these arguments are fundamentally about civilization itself. Either way, it's essential that we understand how culture drives political discourse. To help me dissect this phenomenon, I'm joined by Robin Koerner, an AIER visiting fellow, as well as the academic dean at the John Locke Institute located in Oxford. He received his graduate degrees from Cambridge University in physics and philosophy, and he has written on cultural issues ranging from ideological possession during the COVID era, as well as the virtue of living truthfully at all costs.
Live and let live is what is up for grabs in the culture war. Like if you want to say that, right? And if you want to say that, then I'll say, well, I'm very much on one side of that war. Although the thing that gets me really, passionate is we seem to be at a point now where what some people want to put up for grabs is the very notion of truth itself, right? It's almost like, they want to rewrite mathematics. It's like, it's just getting a bit silly. And I would say the line that I draw on any issue is nobody gets to make me lie, right? I actually think the line, the hill to die on is when society or somebody else demands that you lie. Die on that hill. Like if I've got to pick a hill to die on, and why not? Because we're all going to die anyway, so let's make it count. That's the one. So that so that sounds a little meta, fundamental, or whatever. But actually, it obviously relates directly to issues that get people hot under the collar right now, like pronouns and trans rights and things like that. Like we see it in a lot of places playing out. And that's troublesome, I think. When those kind of things are up for grabs, then everything's up for grabs.
And I think that's an interesting nuance you can sort, because I guess I'll sort of play or I guess I am sort of don't really understand how to approach it, and that could be like your nuanced response. It's like there are some parts of the so-called culture war that are important, some parts that need to be tamped down a little bit, but ultimately culture is important and it's going to be around. We need to engage with it. And that's sort of like, that's your advice on maybe to me and the general public of like, how do we navigate all that?
Okay, so maybe to be a bit more concrete about it, the cultural commanding heights, if you like, they exist. They're the media, they're education. Like media may be more short term, right? The media in general can drive what everyone's talking about for the next week or year or whatever. Education is going to determine, not entirely, but largely where the next generation is going. The left has been very successful, I would say, in the Anglosphere, going back 2 generations, in, let's say, supporting leftist political moves, or let's say even leftist cultural moves, because to a large extent, they got the teachers and they got the children back in, go back to the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And I actually remember, before I had any interest in politics, when I was a teenager in England, and I had no interest in politics, but I do remember a documentary series, TV documentary, wanting to get access to Exeter University teacher training courses. Exeter University is it's a good university in the UK, serious university.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
And but it was particularly renowned, and it probably still is, for all I know, for its education department, teacher training stuff such like. And but I remember, and this is a long time ago, but it stuck with me, that this documentary, this mainstream documentary show, could not get access, was not allowed in to the teacher training courses at Exeter University. It was like they had something to hide. Well, they did have something to hide, right?
Yeah.
Because what was being taught, certainly at that time, there was a lot of outright, Marxism and so on and so forth. It was highly politicized, right? We've got to care about that. I mean, if we're classical liberals or libertarians or whoever we might be, conservatives, however you identify, if somebody is taking over the cultural commanding heights and they want to run the country in the opposite direction from you either have to not care anymore or you've got to acknowledge that there's an issue and you might choose to do something about it. So yeah, I mean, that's just the reality. I don't know. I think that's quite uncontroversial.
Yeah. Why is an Englishman so concerned about American politics?
Oh, that's a good question. Everybody needs to be concerned about American politics because, cliche alert, but shining city on the hill and all that, right? If you spend time in Europe, not specifically in England, but on the continent of Europe, where I've taught, and I've taught in countries like Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic, or whatever, you will appreciate that America matters, that the standards that America set for the things that America has traditionally liked to talk about, liberty and civil rights and so on, they have made a concrete, practical difference to the histories of these other nations in Europe. They make a practical difference to people all around the world, people who are looking to maybe gain for themselves some of the rights that Americans have regarded themselves as champions of. Now, there is maybe some kind of historical inertia, because we might well say that the freedom fighters in, Hong Kong, some of them, and people might dispute that term I'm using, but let's say that there are some students fighting for freedom in other countries that are willing to put a lot more on the line than most Americans right now, right? But that doesn't change the fact that brand America matters, right? It matters that the place that, let's say, self-consciously has pursued certain values and has championed them everywhere, that place still exists. It's still doing it, and it's still working. Because in some respects, when America fails, or those things fail in America, people in other parts of the world, in more tyrannized parts of the world, they lose a lot of hope, because they're like, well, then what are we shooting for? Do we have any chance, right? It just doesn't exist anywhere. Why do we think we can create it here, wherever we might be? So brand America still matters. Now, obviously, I've written about all the respects in which the United States has done the very opposite, has built the very opposite of those things in its own country. Increasingly now, you mentioned the culture wars. We can talk about that, but also abroad. We as a nation, the United States, our foreign policy, we could say historically leaves a lot to be desired. The road to hell being paved with good intentions. We can talk about that too. So I'm not whitewashing anything. I'm not saying it's all kittens and rainbows. It isn't. But psychologically, it matters. American politics, American democracy, American liberty matter as a standard that can be looked to by people outside America.
And when you use the term brand America, and I guess this is especially important as essentially being a foreigner looking in versus someone in the inside looking out, I guess it goes back to the original point I made in the beginning of the culture, quote unquote, being the cultural question being, is America racist or is America exceptional? And that's sort of like one of those questions that doesn't really have strong policy implications, but still matters in the discourse. So I guess on that note, like, what exactly is brand America, and maybe what are the two cultural ways you can look at it?
Well, I don't know that there are two ways of looking at it. I mean, it has been said, and I forget who said it, but I think there's a lot of insight in it, that anything that can be rightly said about America, the opposite can also be rightly said. There is something of that in America, the diversity. I'm thinking of Bill Clinton's quote that there's nothing that's wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. I really hope he's right. I mean, I think there's, with respect to the culture war, there are all kinds of very scary things happening in our culture and politics right now, quite extreme things, I would say. But I also see the reaction against those things coming out of the American grassroots. Now, I don't know what's going to win in the end, if ever there is an end. Maybe there's no such thing as an end in politics, right? All there is transience, right? There's no final equilibrium. It's interesting to me to watch this play out. And obviously I do cheer on one side or the other in certain particular questions. You framed it interestingly, exceptional or racist. I mean, it occurs to me that that's not a dichotomy. I mean, it could be both. It could be neither. I see racism in America, but not in the way that all the Americans worry about it. The racism that I see as a born non-American, where we're not... Okay, let me back up. The American obsession with race is a very American obsession. It's not like racism is all this thing and Americans are doing it. It's a big thing everywhere, and Americans are having to sort their particular historical manifestation out of it. There's a certain obsessiveness, I think, here. And again, it's just an opinion, and I'm speaking as an outsider. We did slavery in England too, but we got over it. We're well over it, right? But my concern, and it is a concern with respect to race in the United States, again, as someone that wasn't brought up in this, so it doesn't feel normal to me, is that everything must be seen through a racial lens, even when it need not be. And even when the doing so creates the very problems that people who are looking through that lens purport to want to undo, right? There is, in many areas of life, you get what you see, right? You can create reality by how you look at something. And I do think that's an issue in the United States, especially with respect to race. And we could talk a lot more about that, I suppose. America being exceptional, the other side of your dichotomy. In my book, which I wrote a while ago now, I did suggest that if America is exceptional, it is because it explicitly and consciously puts certain values meta to politics, right? So there are certain things that are not politically up for grabs. So these are the values that are instantiated in the Constitution. They're manifest by rights, in rights, one might say, that are enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That idea that there are some things that civilization, that freedom depends on, that are not, that are not up for grabs in every political discussion. That is exceptional, I think. And let me make it a bit more clearer. In the United Kingdom, for example, we have socialized medicine, National Health Service, which everybody in the UK loves, by the way, interestingly enough. We could talk about that too. It's now, to many Americans, when we had the Affordable Care Act, right, the right mostly were very upset about the implications of turning over 1/7 of the economy basically to the government, quite rightly, right? And so there were arguments not only about healthcare, but there were arguments about governance. Those arguments about governance don't really happen anywhere else in the world alongside arguments about specific issues, because the governance question has already been entirely conceded, right? And what I mean by that is, if the government decides by democratic majority that something's going to change, then that thing can change, because that's our democracy. Not in America, right? This is the distinction that a lot of Republicans or libertarians would make between when they say we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. That matters, right? So any question about any issue in the United States also has implications for governance, which Americans care about. Do those implications impinge on, if you like, or diminish in some way or attack in some way those supposedly meta-political values? It is good that America cares about that America gets scared when it changes a precedent for governance by letting government take over something that really it doesn't have the right to take over. That distinction between there are things that government may do and may not do, it's very consciously held in the United States, and I think that's exceptional. In the UK, it is not. And the UK is closer to the United States in terms of political culture than for obvious reasons, than continental Europe, other developed Western democracies. So US is here, UK here, rest of the world maybe here, or rest of Europe here. It's kind of exceptional. It's kind of exceptional. Now, it is true that America is quickly becoming less exceptional on this dimension by the day, because Americans are caring less about what sets America apart by the day. These, pre-political or meta-political values. And that is a great shame. And interestingly, immigrants like me who come to America because we want to be in America, not because we're fleeing something awful. I could have had quite a happy life in the UK if I'd wanted. We tend to see it more starkly, I think, than a lot of native-born Americans. And we're more concerned that America doesn't lose it because we came for it, right? So don't throw it away because we just got here because we want to have some, So I know I've said a lot of things there. I don't know which thread you want to pull out, but yeah.
Yeah, this goes to, I want to touch on sort of one of the big principles that you've outlined, which is, and this is like a very common talking point, which is culture precedes politics. And in a way, you're saying that there are certain things that are preserved that are good about America, such as our fundamental liberties or our system of limited government, not necessarily because every American went to law school and studied the Constitution, but because we have a cultural norm that just says freedom is good. Just like in England, I remember when I studied abroad there was all sorts of slogans like, we love our NHS, His Majesty's government, we love His Majesty's government, don't question, like that sort of stuff. And that's why England can have these sort of center values that kind of keep the country together, keep certain important policies in place. So how exactly does culture precede politics, and how do you think America actually established this ether of freedom?
Yeah, okay, so good question, important question. So first of all, when I say culture precedes politics, or when you say it, I would just say that's to a first approximation, right? You can find examples where it kind of works the other way around. So I just want to be clear that in general, culture precedes politics. And I should also mention here the Overton window, right? The Overton window, the idea that you can act in mainstream politics within a range of positions or views. And so one way of thinking about culture preceding politics is that culture sets where that Overton window is and how wide it is, right? So just to be clear about those terms. The people who founded America, it sounds so cliche to say it, but the people who founded America they'd done the work. They'd read John Locke. They'd read, we could go through the names, right? They were very consciously trying to build the society, very explicitly trying to build the society that incorporates the best of what had been learnt in philosophy and governance and so on up until that point. And the men that did that, they'd read the right books, and they'd thought a lot about the experiences, the political experiences that they'd encountered and the cultural experience that they'd encountered. And they took a long time over it, and they were very careful about it. And it seems, generally speaking, that they acted with great integrity. And we've been living off that, we being, the citizens of the United States of America. The other thing, though, I would say about that, and this is not sufficiently appreciated by Americans and America, in my opinion, is that they came, though they were operating in largely a British classical liberal tradition. And when the Patriots gave two fingers, it's now one finger in America, up at George III, they weren't saying we repudiate all of the values of England. They weren't saying we reject all of this, we're going in a 180-degree different direction. What they were saying was, as British people, we have certain rights that right now the British establishment is not honouring. Shame on you, Britain. You know better. And so in most of the appeals that were made by the Patriots, before the War of Independence actually, kicked off, all of those appeals that were made back to the British monarchy and the British Parliament, they were in terms of Magna Carta. Right. There's is it actually, we're in Massachusetts. This is my first week in Massachusetts. It might actually be Massachusetts seal that has the Magna Carta on it, actually. Supreme Court, the doors of the Supreme Court have Magna Carta on them. The appeals that were going back to England were, as Englishmen, we over here in the colonies still have our rights as Englishmen, and you are not honouring them. So the dispute with the motherland was not to be different from the motherland, but to be what the motherland claimed it was, and to allow the Patriots, what they wanted was the rights that they had as Brits. Not, do you see what I'm trying to say? So, and it's called a revolution. Well, a revolution isn't 180 degrees, is it? That's half a revolution. A revolution is 360. And the American Revolution really was a revolution in that technical sense. It was 360. It was saying, no, we already have these rights, but you're not allowing us to exercise them. All right, so we'll fight you so that we can. But they weren't asking for something new. They were asking for what they already had to be honoured. If they had not come out of the British classical liberal tradition, if they had not come out of, the place that came up with Magna Carta and the Petition of Right and the Grand Remonstrance and all the documents that these men had read and knew, and some pieces of which, by the way, are actually verbatim in the founding documents of the United States, which most Americans don't realize, but seems to be rather important, right? If all that weren't the case, then America would not have become what we're saying it is and is valuable. So you asked me how it came about, and there's some of the reasons. It was a conscious effort.
And is this something that necessarily needs to be kept over time, taught in the schools? And I guess this goes to a lot of arguments today, which many people would say, oh, these are, that's such an American way of looking at it. Like, oh, that's such a, maybe some people might say white. Many people would say Anglo-American, which is the term I like to use. And so what you're saying is, sure, many cultures can fundamentally live under these values. It's been, liberal democracy and the classical liberal values have been tried in many countries. They work pretty well. But the answer is yes. This is, in a way, an Anglo-American tradition. And it's not just like a very cost-benefit analysis of, oh, these things are good, these things are bad. But in a way, it's like this is also our culture, and this is what makes us who we are.
I think that's obviously true, because the culture determines what words get used a lot in answer to what questions, what thoughts are triggered in response to what statements or what things you see on the news. And culture rather determines that. Now, just to be clear, there is a sense in which the Anglo-American, let's say, tradition of liberty isn't unique. You can obviously find philosophy and moments in history that instantiate liberty in different cultures, in different countries, right? And the moments that matter for freedom in different countries and different cultures tend to be moments where a particular culture finds a way of making the ideas of liberty, or indeed any ideas, their own, right? So in our tradition, Magna Carta would be an obvious one, right? And the Declaration of Independence, in the case of the United States, an obvious one. But different countries have their own Magna Cartas, right? Whether it's you could find it in Hungarian history, for example. So in as much as those values in those other cultures are operative, you will see the importance of and the reverence for those moments in the history of those cultures where the relevant bits of philosophy or the relevant ideas become concretized in politics, historically. So that's a that's a ubiquitous phenomenon. But since we're talking about education, you asked me about, do we need to teach this? I would say it makes sense for every country to teach its own history, to teach the good and the bad of it. And I don't think you can seriously understand America if you don't understand some of what we're talking about here. If I had kids, I would want them to, and they were American, I would want them to know some of that. Just as if I had kids and they were English, I'd be quite happy for them to know a little bit about, the English history and the kings and the queens. Not because one's better or worse, but because it's how we understand ourselves and how we understand how we in our culture make the best of ourselves, or maybe have failed to make the best of ourselves. Like, we need to learn the good and the bad. Of course we should learn the good and the bad of other cultures too. But in some ways, understanding like charity begins at home, because it begins with what you can most identify with, right? And of course you identify most with the culture in which you're brought up. The culture in which you're brought up determines the things that you take for granted, that you don't even know aren't everywhere.
So that touches on a great point, and going into sort of what exactly, when people use the term culture war today, and then I think a big facet many people can point to is overeducation. For example, critical race theory, trying to teach American history in a very racialized, fundamentally racist way, and the Trump administration essentially created like an alternative curriculum, the basically trying to glorify things about America. So when we talk about sort of like culture, and especially as it pertains to all the fights over school curriculums today, do you think that that's sort of a fundamental understanding of both sides, the left and the right, that what we teach our kids and how we portray America culturally is very important to how the policy implications of that will come out?
Well, I guess it's what I said earlier, that the way you educate your kids has an effect. Right, that's it. And if it didn't, you wouldn't bother educating them, would you? Right? If it had no effect whatsoever, why were we even bothering? If it had no effect whatsoever, what is there to play for? Why does Trump care? Why do the left care if there's nothing really to play for? If you're playing for the minds of kids, you're playing for the minds of everybody, right? Eventually, because those kids grow up and they vote and they become leaders. So all I'm saying is it matters, and I'm not saying, and I'm not, as it were, flying the flag for a particular curriculum or some other curriculum. What I'm saying is, when it comes to education, your obligation is the truth. Your obligation certainly is, if we're talking about history education, for example, certainly to realizing that nobody by the time they're out of school is going to have a full picture of history. I think a good way of approaching history, this kind of history, would be to try and help students understand what ideas have resulted in what outcomes and to what extent. And also to point to hypocrisies, right? Juxtapose maybe the claim that these ideas are good with these actions that do not correspond with those ideas. What have these ideas produced? What have these actions produced? I mentioned, American foreign policy disasters. There are plenty, right? We say we believe in this, but then we go and do this. Is that consistent or not? If I'm teaching someone to be a good historian, that's a basic skill. I think you want them to have. Critical thinking. I guess all I'm doing is saying truth and critical thinking. And I don't really care about the way in. As long as, if you present a perspective, you're honest about the fact that that's what you're doing, and you empower students to find other views. You've got to be teaching without worrying too much about the particular outcome in terms of the belief of the student. You've got to empower that student to make his own way or her own way, right, intellectually, in terms of, the beliefs that they end up forming. I think any school that's trying to inculcate particular beliefs in students, that's not a school. if that makes sense.
Yes, it's more of a like political indoctrination more than learning.
Yeah, and that is what education seems to be increasingly becoming, or some people want to make it that, and that's what I'm against. If I'm against anything when it comes to education.
And so when people use it, when I think a lot of pundits in the media today would say, American politics is becoming too volatile, it's coming too hot, the stakes are too high, people are arguing too much. Why do you think there is so much debate over, like transgender bathrooms, toxic masculinity, is everything racist, to smoke weed, not to smoke, all these lifestyle questions that have nothing to do with whether or not my taxes are going up or down, or whether or not I'm going to be able to open a business or something like that, or educate my kids at a good school. But, like things that many Americans and many advocacy groups would continue to say are irrelevant. The American people are tired of it, but these voices are just so loud and they dominate the conversation. So why is that happening?
I think you make a good point that that many people, probably the majority of people, are tired of a lot of this, and still it goes on. And it's because the vocal minority has taken the cultural commanding heights, which goes to my point, right? The very fact that you're asking me that question, you're listing those issues, is because the people that want us bothered about those issues, they've got those commanding heights. And the people that had other, let's say, philosophical or political commitments, they vacated the space, right? It's a tricky one, because here I am saying education shouldn't really fundamentally be about politics. It certainly shouldn't be about politicizing students. But the problem is, there are a bunch of people that absolutely want to take over education to do that. So as someone who doesn't want to do that, I'm kind of by default having to act politically just in resisting that, right? That's kind of a political act, you might say, or a political position. It's happened because the minority, it's the Mead quote, right? About the determined minority. The determined minority has put themselves in the places and got themselves the megaphones where they can disproportionately dictate. They can dictate our discourse, and they can affect the beliefs of the kids who are leaving schools, let's say. I'm sure you know the statistics, the likes of which Jonathan Haidt compiles, right?
Yes.
About how the humanities are absolutely overrun with leftist academics. Okay, overrun isn't his word; it's my word. But that's a problem. And I don't care if you're a progressive. If you're a progressive, good luck to you. But but you shouldn't be happy with that. I mean, if you're a progressive, you should not be happy with that level of representation of your view exclusively in the academy, because that means the academy is failing as the academy. And if you care about kids' education, which is something all of us do, I think, and especially progressives, that's not good enough. So what are we doing about it? So the flip side of that is the minority, the vocal minority, the fervent minority has done the work. The majority that is quieter, that is getting on living its life, has been very quiet for very long, which is fine, because, as I say, they're getting on living their life. They're not, they've got other things to do than take over the academy or take over the media. But at some point, the silenced majority has to say, right, okay, the just getting on with our lives has cost us too much because of what has been taken over. And we have to increasingly start refusing to comply, right? You got to stand up. Like I said, we're starting to see parents standing up for basic common sense in schools against certain kind of, let's say, activist, politically driven rules that their kids are subject to, right? So on and so forth. And the majority always operates late, right? We're waking up, or people are waking up. Basically, apolitical people are waking up saying, oh, okay, that's an Ayn Rand point, right? That it would be nice not to have to deal with politics, but if you don't deal with politics, then politics deals with you. Okay, so more and more people are waking up to that. And the thing is, when they come for your kids, That's the moment. If you've got kids, when they come for the kids, right, then everything else becomes less important when you're protecting your kids. And I think a lot of the, what we might say, maybe extreme kind of leftist culture warriors, they've started coming for the kids. And I think just regular, decent Americans, and I don't mean conservative Americans, I just mean just normal people, many of whom vote Democrat, are going, hold on, this is getting silly now. This is getting dangerous now. And at a great, this is a great time to be making that point, because the level of compliance with the takedown of rights that was the lockdown, that was, the mandates, that was the coerced medical treatment without informed consent, that's an outrage. And the fact that the majority of Americans actually said, yeah, we'll have some of that. Right. I mean, this is the lights going off in the shining city of the hill, right, on the hill. So, it's all up for grabs. Normal people now need to say, absolutely not. And I don't know that enough are, and that if enough are, that they will in time. There's hope, but I don't know how it's going to play out.
So it's clear that any political savvy camp understands that these cultural questions then lead to political outcomes that favor their side. And you've got this silent majority who doesn't want to deal with this, wants to live their lives, wants to be left alone, that's increasingly being squeezed by both sides, whether it's one agenda or the other. So given that people want to, maybe want to see an end to the so-called culture war, they want to see de-escalation of these tensions, what is Robin Koerner's advice to the average American who just wants to send their kids to a nice school, wants the neighborhood to be safe, wants to have some savings to pass on? Do they get involved in the culture war? Do they vote a certain way? Do they try to de-escalate? What is the solution?
Okay, so kind of in one way, I agree with Ron Paul on this, right? Ron Paul always used to say, whatever feels right to you, whatever moves you, do that. However you are moved, do that. What is good for one person is not going to work for another. What somebody can really get their teeth into, someone's going to leave somebody cold. What a fight that somebody over here might be good at taking on, maybe even winning, somebody over here may not have the wherewithal to even confront, right? So it's different for different people, and it's different for different situations. So for example, because I used the example of the parent with the kid at school, and there's something crazy coming down the line at the kid, well then that's the situation you've been given. Then that's your fight, probably, right? And anything I might say about, well, this is more important or that's more important in general, no. That's your fight, because that's what you're moved to do, That's the eggs, your eggs are in that basket. They're in the basket of your kid, or whatever it might be, right? So I would make that general point, that there's no one answer that fits all, except there kind of is. There is one thing that you must always be committed to, I think, and that is the truth. You must never go along with a lie. And people have been doing this, right? People have been going along with acting on or saying things that they don't really believe, because the cost of doing otherwise is too high, right? So for example, maybe going along with a mandate, a vaccine mandate, again, just because we mentioned it, it's in my mind and it's something I happen to care about at work, because you don't want to face all of the trauma of losing your job. Well, okay, then if you actually believe that this is a step too far with respect to people's liberties, if you believe that, then you got to pay the price, right? Or you're part of the problem. Like sometimes you don't get to sit it out, right? When they come for you with the gun or the needle or the textbook or whatever it is, right? You've got to say, yeah, okay, I will go along. And in going along, you normalize it and you make it easier for the people doing it. Or you've got to say no, and this might hurt me. And the attitude of no, and this might hurt me, that's the attitude that in everybody's different situations, you've got to be prepared to take when the chips are down. And obviously you do have to pick your battles. But I actually think once you concede, as I say, once you give up the commitment to truth, once you actually go along with a lie or something you believe in your heart of hearts to be wrong, doesn't matter what anyone else believes, and you comply, then you've gone to the dark side. That's it. Then you've lost it. The history of the values that matter, including liberty, but not just that one, is the history of men and women dying for it when they had to. And sometimes it's obvious that they're dying and why. Like, I don't know, when the Nazis try and invade England, right? Then, okay, well, all the English are going to fight back, right? But sometimes it's less obvious. And sometimes it's less obvious, not because it's not easy to see, but because everybody's got a vested interest in not seeing what's actually going on, right? So I mentioned the Nazis. There are a lot of people that had a vested interest in not seeing what the Nazis were doing to the Jews in their own cities. Now, there's a lot of people in America that have had a vested interest in not seeing the terrifying implications of what we've let the government do with respect to, the mandates and the coerced vaccination, experimental treatments, and the lockdowns. I mean, we people went to house arrest in this country. And then you can argue, you can try and backtrack and you can say, oh, well, not really, and it wasn't really important. No, you know what they were saying, you know what they were trying to do. What side do you want, right? Now, if you're not on any side, if you don't think that matters, if you think it's absolutely fine, then you don't have any moral obligation to do anything about it. But I do, because I don't think it's okay. I don't think it's okay to stand by when a school tells a child something that is demonstrably false, let's say. I'm not thinking of any particular example there, but I would, or even to go along with an instruction at work that is premised on a falsehood. If you want to put your, just carry on making a salary and paying your mortgage, you can do that. That's a choice. But realize you're part of the corruption. If to make that choice, you're conceding your integrity and your commitment to truth. Once you concede the commitment to truth, you can't be counted on to defend anything of value, right? Right? Because you can make anything up. You can accept anything. So that's where I draw the line. That's where I think everybody should draw the line. But I understand that the drawing of that line looks completely different for different people in different situations with maybe different opinions about different things.
And I guess sort of the quick, maybe utopian, maybe kind of crazy, but maybe not so much answer would be not having a government that has the ability to impose all these mandates from 10,000 feet above for either side, essentially living in a free society. Maybe perhaps that could work. Maybe that's worked for us for the past 200 years.
Well, there you go to an important general point that certainly classical liberals and libertarians like to make, which is, you only have these kind of brutal political or cultural wars when what is at stake is the power of a government to do things that no government really should have the power to do, right? If the government has this kind of power, then it makes sense to fight hard for it because it might be used by your opponents against you, right? If we don't have kind of governance that allows this level of intrusion, this level of mandate, then there's less to play for. There's going to be less polarization because it's safer just to get on and live your own life whilst letting the other guy live his, doing the live and let live. It is the power and size of government that makes live and let live impossible, right? So yes, I mean, that's a very important point.
Well, I'd love to wrap up what has been an excellent interview. And I guess before we leave, I have one burning question, which is, how does someone with a physics graduate degree talk about all this?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a good question. Oh, I'm sorry we don't have another hour. If I have anything interesting or original to say, and maybe I don't, but if I do, I think it's because I come at questions of politics and culture and economics not having gone through the normal education for somebody interested in those things. I think it enables me to see certain ideas and assumptions anew, but but with kind of, let's say, the experiences of adulthood, and go, actually, no, I don't get that, or really, or actually that is based on an assumption that deserves questioning, because I haven't, I haven't kind of bought into all the, or even been exposed to the regular body of ideas that constitutes the training for somebody interested in the humanities. So I actually like being, so you mentioned at the beginning that I'm the dean at the John Locke Institute. We're there concerned with the humanities. It's philosophy, politics, economics, and history. I like being in that space as someone who's trained in physics, for the reason I've just given, but also because I actually do think, and I'm biased, I admit my bias here, that there is no better mental training in terms of just rigor, sharpness, logic than mathematics or physics. I think there's a lot to be said for pursuing either of those subjects as far as you can, whatever else you want to do. There are right and wrong answers in those subjects. And I think it helps to come to the humanities with at least a preference for finding right answers, or at least where they cannot be found definitively, being able to see why the answer that may otherwise be given by somebody else is wrong. Yes, but I'm also a polymath. I've always been a bit of a generalist, and it was philosophical questions that actually moved me into physics, but that's a conversation for another day.
Of course. Well, Robin, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Ethan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If you really like what you heard today and want to support more cutting-edge researchers like Robin, make sure to become a donor. All that information and more can be found at AIER.org.